All right. Hello. Welcome. Thank you guys so much for coming. We'll give everyone a few minutes just to hop into the Zoom. But if you're already in here, feel free to put in the chat where you're coming from, where you're watching from. We're super excited. All right, we'll get started. So hello, welcome. I'm Clara DePablo. I use pronouns she, her. I'm the program manager of Portal, the National Portrait Gallery's Scholarly Center. So Portal promotes the study of American portraiture and visual biography. Increasingly interdisciplinary, the field of American portraiture nevertheless remains underdeveloped in the United States. We especially seek to support analyses of the production of portraits, their uses, and their cultural meanings within global contexts. We're very pleased to present today's event as part of the Greenberg Steinhauser Forum in American Portraiture. The National Portrait Gallery gratefully acknowledges the late Daniel B. Greenberg, whose generosity and that of his wife, Susan, make the Greenberg Steinhauser Forum possible. So you can keep an eye on our website for Portal programming and sign up for our newsletter, which will pop into the chat in just a moment. And we also have a YouTube channel where you can watch any past programs that you might have missed. So please use the chat, let us know where you're tuning in from, and please feel free to use the Q&A function throughout the entire program to ask questions to our incredible panelists that we'll answer at the end. And although we're tuning in together from different places, we gratefully acknowledge the Native peoples on whose ancestral homelands we gather, as well as the diverse and vibrant Native communities who make their home in these places today. All right, I'm seeing that the chat is disabled. We'll get that working in just a moment. So thank you so much for joining us for today's Greenberg Steinhauser Forum entitled Portraiture and Memorialization, Kent State and Ruben Salazar. This program will feature a conversation between Mindy Farmer and Gabrielle Tillenburg. We'll explore the role of portraiture in memorializing historical events, what's been forgotten versus what gets remembered. Today, we're going to look at art created to memorialize anti-Vietnam War protests in the 1970s. So we're going to look at two protests, the Kent State Massacre of 1970 and the activist Ruben Salazar, who was killed by police later that year. So I'd like to introduce our speakers. First, we have Gabrielle Tillenburg, a curatorial assistant for Latino art at the National Portrait Gallery. She's currently pursuing a PhD in Caribbean and diasporic art history at the University of Maryland. We also have Mindy Farmer, a historian at the National Portrait Gallery. She's the former director of the Kent State Memorial Visitor Center. All right, so take it away, Gabby.
Thanks so much. Hi, everyone. I'm Gabrielle, or Gabby. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm very excited to be presenting today along with Mindy Farmer. We're going to be presenting two case studies on portraiture and memorialization, as Clara just mentioned. We'll explore how communities remember the victims of the Kent State Massacre and also the slain journalist Ruben Salazar. All of these are individuals whose deaths occurred during protests against the Vietnam War. We'll highlight how these figures are remembered through art and memorials, how memorialization can be effective or ineffective, and what impacts memorials have on our remembrance of historical events. First, I'll be discussing Ruben Salazar, a Mexican-American journalist who was killed while covering a rally that protested the disproportionate deaths of Chicanos and other people of color on the front lines of the Vietnam War. We'll examine three portraits of Salazar, one of which is in our own collection, and another in the American Art Museum's collection. So we'll examine those three portraits and how they cemented Salazar's legacy as a martyr for a larger political movement. Then Mindy will provide a brief historical account of the Kent State Massacre, also known at Kent State University as the May 4th shootings, which led to the death of 4 students protesting the Vietnam War. She'll explore the landscape of memorialization on campus and in the surrounding community with insights into how public memorials address or fail to address a tragic past. All right, so let's begin. And to begin our exploration of memorialization of Ruben Salazar, I want to start with some background on his life and the significant role he played in Chicano history. Salazar made his name as a prominent journalist in Los Angeles from the late 1950s until his death in 1970. As a Mexican American, he was especially poised to offer editorial perspectives that had been largely overlooked. Many of his written works offered fresh insights into the critical social realities facing Mexican Americans in Los Angeles and the borderlands at large. His seminal essay entitled "Who is a Chicano and What is it the Chicanos Want?" offered a definition of Chicano widely used today. Quote, "A Mexican American with a non-Anglo image of himself," end quote. Someone whose culture predates the arrival of the Anglo-Americans to the region now known as the Southwestern United States. Salazar's coverage also figured prominently in the ongoing struggle known as the Chicano movement, which advocated for the civil rights of Mexican Americans and sought to combat inequality and racism. His reports highlighted cases of civil rights infringement against Chicanos in Los Angeles and brought attention to the movement's cause. It's no surprise then that Salazar would cover the National Chicano Moratorium against the Vietnam War, a march that led protesters down Los Angeles' Whittier Boulevard towards Laguna Park, where speakers, folklorico dancers, and community groups were together. Taking place on August 29th, 1970, this rally was the largest gathering of Mexican-American protesters. Numbering 20,000 to 30,000, they were joined by African Americans and Asian Americans in solidarity, who together called for an end to the Vietnam War and wanted to call national attention to the war's disproportionate impact on people of color in the US. At the time, statistics demonstrated that twice as many soldiers with Hispanic names had died over those with Anglo names. For protesters, the war abroad was not only immoral and unjust, it highlighted the deep-rooted inequalities at home. The event turned violent when police pursued robbery suspects from a separate incident into the crowd. The police then began to violently break up the protest. Bringing in reinforcements, they used tear gas projectiles, buckshot pellets, and batons against protesters, escalating the rally into a riot through their excessive force. And belatedly, in 2011, the Los Angeles Sheriff's Department released a report by the Inspector General that confirmed deputies had, in fact, used excessive force and were poorly trained to handle large crowds. For many at the time, however, the police's use of excessive force was not a surprise. Salazar himself had been reporting on police brutality against the Chicano population just that year. Ruben Salazar was one of 3 deaths that day. Salazar had taken a break from, excuse me, Salazar had taken a break from reporting on the rally and headed into the Silver Dollar Bar and Cafe on Whittier Boulevard with a friend. He used the restroom and settled in to order a beer. Responding to a report that there were 2 armed men inside the bar, a report that later turned out to be false, Sergeant Thomas Wilson and other deputies fired tear gas canisters into the bar's open doorway. This included a 10-inch torpedo-shaped missile that would normally be used to burst through plywood barricades. And it was this missile that hit Salazar in the head and killed him. Killed on duty while reporting on the Chicano movement, it was not long after his death that the movement recognized him as a martyr. Just 18 days after he died, his portrait, seen here, spray painted by Sergio Hernandez, was paraded in the street during a celebration of Mexico's independence, which doubled as a march and rally in Salazar's honor. The image of Salazar's portrait paraded through the street and lifted up by the crowd evoked Catholic processions honoring saints and martyrs. But through a Chicano point of view, Salazar's friend Alberto Juarez remarked that it was, quote, as if the crowd were carrying an Inca god or Moctezuma, end quote. One day after this memorial march celebrating Mexican independence, Laguna Park, which was the final stop for the Chicano Moratorium rally and where much of the violence erupted, was renamed after Ruben Salazar. And in 2011, a mural was commissioned at the park to celebrate Chicano legacies. And it honors Salazar among others who are regarded as martyrs to the Chicano movement. According to Joan Medrano, author of a poignant essay called The Ever-Changing Legacy of Ruben Salazar, Chicano activists cemented Salazar's image as a martyr by, quote, tying the brutality of the riots and violence that ensued during the Chicano moratorium to his death. As a result, Salazar became a hero for Chicanos in East LA, an image that has not only persisted, but remains the strongest facet of his legacy, end quote. Rupert Garcia's portrait of Ruben Salazar is one such image, and this is a portrait that is in our collection and will be on display in an upcoming exhibition on pop art. So painted in the year of his death, 1970, as we see here, this acrylic portrait is comprised of a grid with 4 close-ups of Salazar's face. Employing a pop aesthetic, artist Garcia, who is a Vietnam veteran turned anti-war activist, used pure black shadow against bright colors to contour Ruben's face. One can easily view the similarities between this portrait and the work of the pop art giant Andy Warhol. And Andy Warhol used gridded two-toned images that famously conceptualized what it means to look at mass media photographs, particularly those of celebrities whose fame had only been accelerated by tragedy, such as the Kennedys and Marilyn Monroe. In this work, for example, this portrait of Jackie Kennedy, we're prompted to reflect on the public's voyeurism of Jackie through images that were made available by photography and print culture, particularly surrounding the death of her husband. In the case of Salazar's portrait, Garcia's attention to mass media and camera-produced images points to a more insidious mode of voyeurism, that of surveillance. Just days before Salazar's death, the journalist disclosed to friends that he believed he was being surveilled by the police and felt his life to be in danger. In fact, 1 month before his death, he was visited by police officers who warned him that he was damaging the public image of the LAPD and that his reports were, quote, dangerous in the minds of Chicanos. Decades later, an LA Times reporter who was exploring the death of Ruben Salazar, and there's a great series of articles by the LA Times on the anniversary of the Chicano moratorium that I encourage checking out. But this LA Times reporter, and kind of uncovering some of this history, found that there were a multitude of internal files on Salazar assembled by the LAPD and further documents that were put together by the FBI. But in recovering those, much of those documents had been either part of it redacted or part of it withheld. Ultimately, the death was not investigated as a homicide, and it still remains unclear if Salazar was purposely targeted, but many believe that Salazar was strategically killed. In their eyes, the very person who had reported on the oppression and brutality against Chicanos became a victim of it, and this is what in many ways made him a martyr. In Garcia's portrait, we're reminded of the threat of police surveillance as we move clockwise from the top left and closer into Salazar's face. And with each square going from yellow, red, green to orange, we might imagine hearing the click of a camera shutter as it zooms in further on the journalist with each frame. While this visual cue evokes the surveillance of Salazar and reminds us of the risks he took, which may have led to his downfall, it also results in an enlarged abstracted image of Salazar. This macro abstract image may seem odd for a memorial portrait, but it also speaks to how monumental Salazar had become so soon after his death, and how his legacy became much more abstracted in the context of a broader political movement. Indeed, Salazar's image took on a mythic status. In heroic voice, artist David Alfaro Siqueiros pays homage to Salazar. The lithograph depicts the journalist poised above Siqueiros' typical rendering of chain-breaking laborers who evoke Aztec gods that were so often found in Siqueiros' murals. Here, Siqueiros visually links Salazar to a broader struggle for justice that the artist was so famous for depicting. But this type of memorialization was not favored by Salazar's family and friends. Frank del Olmo, described Siqueiros's rendering of Salazar as a martyr with, quote, a distance-long suffering look to the eyes, end quote. And this did not accurately portray who was his longtime friend and colleague, to his mind. Salazar's wife, Sally, also took issue with the public image of her late husband, stating, quote, my memories are confused by the murals and memorials and a creation built in the public mind. Someone other people call Ruben Salazar, but someone who to this day I don't fully recognize, end quote. Salazar's image had become an icon for the movement, and for his family, this removed him from his memory as a father and husband. Nevertheless, the ways in which Salazar was memorialized not only cemented an image of the journalist in collective memory as a martyr, but as someone whose death was a catalyst for the Chicano movement itself. The scene of his death is depicted in the monumentally sized painting Death of Ruben Salazar by Chicano artist Frank Romero. And this is actually up on display currently in the Smithsonian American Art Museum. Gestural brushwork in reds, yellows, and blues accentuates an intense scene. 5 police officers in riot gear point their weapons upwards, launching tear gas cannons that explode in yellow and orange atop the silver dollar bar, marked by posters of nude women which appear on the actual building on Whittier Boulevard. On what would otherwise be a vibrant but quiet street, the police are the perpetrators. There are no other figures depicted. Despite the artwork's title, The Death of Ruben Salazar, the journalist is not pictured within the scene. Instead, the movie theater marquee to the right of the silver dollar reads the title of the artwork, The Death of Ruben Salazar, in Spanish, La Muerte de Ruben Salazar. And this is as if it's prophesizing what is to come just seconds after this particular scene plays out. Artist Romero chose not to depict Salazar in his moment of death, and this is a choice that I'd like to highlight. As viewers, we're denied the ability to observe his body, even through the silver dollar doorway, which is shrouded in darkness. For a work that memorializes someone's death, perhaps it seems strange not to include their image. But I would argue that artist Romero's decision to depict this catalytic moment without showing us the slain body does something to preserve Salazar's dignity. There has been a lot of discussion in recent years on how images can further dehumanize victims of murder, brutality, or violent oppression, particularly for those from marginalized groups who have experienced disproportionate violence. And this is only exceeded with camera phones and social media and news media outlets. In 2019, for example, Oscar Alberto Martinez and his infant daughter, Angie Valeria, tragically died crossing the Rio Grande to seek a better life in the United States. Garnering massive media attention, an image of their bodies in the river stirred awareness of the border crisis, but advocacy groups also questioned how to ethically share this image with respect for Oscar, Angie, and their family. This conversation is not new, and it extends backwards in history to the 1955 lynching of Emmett Till, whose mother, Till Bradley, insisted in an open casket funeral to expose the world to the horror of the murder of her teenage son. It prompts us to ask, how do we memorialize those who have been killed unjustly? Graphic images of victims at their time of death are effective in conveying a harsh reality and waking up a public, so to speak, to oppression, prejudice, corruption, and other circumstances that lead to such violence. However, memorialization often asks us how we want to remember those who are no longer with us. Romero, in this case, memorializes Salazar by picturing the moment of his death without cementing an image in the viewer's mind of the victimized, brutalized body. Nevertheless, by drawing attention to the violent circumstances of his death, Romero memorializes a catalytic moment for the Chicano movement and Salazar's death as one that shook a community. The varied ways Ruben Salazar has been memorialized underscore the complexity of representing those who have been killed unjustly. From pop aesthetics to saint-like imagery, these memorials reflect broader concepts about dignity, representation, and remembrance. So now I'm going to turn it to Mindy, who will pick up some of these themes as she delves into the May 4th shootings at Kent State University.
Thank you, Gabby. That was really insightful. And we purposely wanted to start with a story that is a little less known than the shootings at Kent State, because too often so many histories of that era began with after Kent State or before Kent State. It was important for us to start with Ruben Salazar because there are many martyrs in this year, and we wanted to foreground that history. I wanted to start kind of in an unusual place with this talk. This is from August 24th, 2023, a photograph when winds of change literally blew through Kent State University. A fierce, unexpected storm caused pretty significant damage to the Kent State Memorial, and in turn reopened old wounds about the memorial landscape of Kent State. And I'm going to talk more about, not as much about the actual history of the May 4th shootings, but the period of reconciliation that started immediately after and still continues to this day. For many people, their memory of Kent State or impression of Kent State was born from this very famous photograph. This is arguably one of the most iconic images to come out of the 1970s. And I want to speak for a minute about each of the components of this and all of the individuals who are pictured. Let's start first with John Philo. John Philo was a student photographer, a senior at Kent State when he took this photograph. He won the Pulitzer Prize and has gone on to have an astounding career as a photojournalist, a respected photographer. And this really, for him, catapulted him into national recognition. Let's talk then about the bystanders. So because school shootings were a new event, not many had happened, all of these students were sent home, and they were sent home without counseling, without support. They were all, none of the kind of counseling things we see from therapy dogs to therapists were a part of the 1970s. They were just sent home without support. Some went home to families who blamed them for their role in the shootings. There were many people who, even in Kent State and even in the city of Kent, who believed that the students invited the shootings. It became a very contested discussion at many dinner tables. I also want to talk about the girl in the center. Her name is Marianne Vecchio. She was a 14-year-old runaway when this photo was taken. She had fled from her parents in Florida. They didn't know where she was until they saw her in this photograph. After this, she immediately went to Indianapolis, where it was a local journalist discovered her name. And I'm going to read just a quote from her, and we're going to put in the chat a link to a story I highly recommend you read about the story of the girl behind the photo. And she said, "I would have stayed anonymous forever," she told the Washington Post, "but that guy from the Indianapolis Star, he knocked out my future." And even today, her life is defined by this moment, the moment she was the girl screaming over the body of Jeffrey Miller. And that brings us to Jeffrey Miller. His family struggled with the fact that this was the photograph where the world learned about their loved ones. And they tried for years to escape this image, unsuccessfully. Every May 4, every commemoration, this photo is seen. And I just want to quote Jeffrey Miller's mom. "To most people, Kent State is just one of those traumatic events that occurred during a tumultuous time. To me, it's the one experience I will never recover from. It's also the one gap in my communication with my older son, Russ. Neither of us dares to talk about what happened at Kent State for fear that will open floodgates of emotion we can't deal with." Let's go to the next slide. So this, in addition to all of the thoughts and emotions that this photograph inspired, it also inspired a number of pieces of art. I just want to go through some of these briefly. You can see this one. This is from our collection. This is from our Time collection. This was the cover of Time magazine after the shootings. And you can see this was inspired by that famous photograph. We can move to another example. This one is by Vic Muniz. Vic Muniz is still a Brazilian artist. And he remembered this incident from his childhood, but he was inspired to create a series of works called the Best of Life series. And the Best of Life came from a book when he was in Chicago that he purchased at a garage sale. That was literally, as it describes, the best of life photography. And this was his effort to, without looking at those, recreate the images from his memory. And so he first drew them and then he photographed them. It was a very complex process. But the degree to which that stuck in his mind and the accuracy is really remarkable. And this memory rendering of the Kent State shooting is a powerful reminder of just how that image stuck in the minds of many. This is another example, just as Gabby talked about Garcia and Warhol. Richard Hamilton was another famous pop artist. He was a British pop artist. And he created this image from what he was seeing on television. And I want to quote him again to talk about this. Every night I sat watching TV with a shutter release in my hand. In the middle of the week, the shootings of students by National Guardsmen occurred at Kent State University. This tragic event produced the most powerful images that emerged from the camera, yet I felt a reluctance to use any of them. It was too terrible an incident in American history to submit to arty treatment. Yet there it was in my hand by chance. I didn't really choose the subject, it offered itself. It seemed right too, that art could help to keep the shame in our minds. The wide distribution of a large edition print might be the strongest indictment I could make. And then we have this piece. This piece is by Henry Hallam. And in this case, rather than having an international perspective, he has a very local perspective. Henry Hallam came to Kent State as a professor in 1969. He taught glass and is a very distinguished glass-blowing artist in his own right. And he has created a number of works that respond directly to the events of May 4, and then this work, which responds to a little bit of what happened afterwards. The very first indictments against anyone following the Kent State shootings were not against the guardsmen or any of the people in charge. It was against what's known as the Kent State 25. And the Kent State 25 were a group of students, former students, and a faculty member who were charged in their role for inciting riots. Nearly all of those charges were dropped. But this is a response to, as you can see, the Ravenna grand jury, which is the grand jury that offered those indictments, and the mass bandit of the people who got away, in his mind, from any accountability. And no guardsman would ever receive any punishment for the events of the Kent State shootings. And while people are very familiar with John Philo's photograph of Marion Vecchio and Jeffrey Miller, this is another iconic image, though slightly less known, but very important to the story of Kent State memorialization and memory. So this is the first time the National Guard kneeled and pointed their weapons at a student. And the student in the foreground is Alan Canfora. He's waving his black flag of protest. Alan Canfora had a long history of activism before the Kent State shootings, and he would have an even longer longer period of activism afterwards. He would become the de facto voice of so many families and students who wanted the university to remember. And he would become key in planning the commemorative events. So for 5 years, the university organized a commemoration to the Kent State shootings. But after that, they felt as though enough time had passed. And in the absence of the university planning events, students started to plan the events. And Allen would lead at various times what's called the May 4 Task Force, which was the student group who organized the commemorations from 5 years past up until right before the 50th. They actually, at Allen's encouragement, the university retook over the role of planning commemorations for the 50th commemoration. In that role, he would be a strong advocate for creating a memorial. And you can see here, this is an example of him pushing and organizing. This is from the May 4 Task Force. You can see that. This is a commemorative poster for the 1988 commemoration. And it's important for a few reasons. So the process of creating a memorial, an official memorial by the university at Kent State began in 1985 when there was a formal announcement made for a competition. That competition was modeled to a degree after the very successful memorial competition for the Vietnam Memorial. It was anonymous. There were a number of judges, some from Kent State, some who were experts in memorialization, some dignitaries, and they eventually selected Ian Tabner as the #1 choice. Unfortunately, however, that #1 choice was disqualified because it was a group of people and one of them was from Canada. And the very first rule, or one of the most prominent rules in the awards competition, is that it had to be an American designer. So in the news about that qualification, or in this case, disqualification, a number of organizations came out to oppose the memorial. The largest was the Ohio branch of the American Legion. And in April 1986, just after the original submission, the first choice was disqualified, they wrote a letter calling the efforts to memorialize the Kent State shootings, a quote, memorial to terrorists. And soon after, the Ohio Fraternal Order of Police issued a very similar statement. So as a result of that, the second place designer was chosen, that's Bruno Ast. And the fundraising, which was originally set at 1.3 million, fell drastically short. So while Bruno Ast was selected, he was asked to resubmit a design that did not exceed $100,000. And this is the memorial he produced. This memorial opened in 1990 with that $100,000. So some estimates say 25 to even 10% of the original design. And it came under some controversy because initially it didn't include any of the victims' names, not the 4 students killed, not the 9 wounded. But just prior to dedication, a plaque was added. You can't even see it here. It's kind of behind a bush. And that plaque was the first time that the students were named at the commemorative landscape at Kent State. And if we go back, we'll show this image again. You can see what's interesting about this is it has the original design there front and center. So you can see how much bigger it was. I think it's important that it says make peace with the past, because what was to happen with that memorial still is a point of contention. There are still people, especially with this damage that occurred recently, who called for the memorial to be completed. There are still people who feel like this was never a proper memorial at all. And there are still people who feel that something needs to be completely rebuilt. And then there are still people who feel like this is a memorial. And this comes directly from a Facebook quote that was on one of the Kent State posts about the efforts to repair the memorial, who said, quote, "Let's just remove this memorial to a riot." So even today, there's disagreement over what to do with this memorial that was never fully completed. Let's move to some of the other efforts. So while that was the official memorial by Kent State, opened in 1990, it took a long time, and it's still the memorial landscape is still under negotiation, and there's still things being added. This is an image from the 2000 commemoration. So up until 1999, there were no markers to indicate where the 4 students were killed. All 4 of them were killed in the parking lot. And until 1990, you could park in the spots where they were shot. This is the first commemoration, May 4, 2000, where there's actually a dedicated marker. And you can see this was for Allison Krauss. I also want to talk about some of the other things in the photo because they talk about other aspects of memorialization. So the cups you see hold candles. So every night, the day before the May 4 commemoration, so May 3rd, there is a silent candlelight march through campus to honor the victims of the May 4 shootings. And that March of Remembrance takes the marchers through various parts of the campus that were important to the shootings on Kent State. You can see the rocks that are at the top of the pillars. That's a Jewish tradition. 3 of the 4 students were Jewish, leaving behind a rock to remember the victims. And what you can't see, but would be a part of this, is that from the candlelight march, which ends around midnight, until the commemoration the next morning, which starts around noon, someone stands visual all night in these spaces where the 4 students were killed. And that's in honor of the fact that no student was allowed to remain on campus after the shootings because everyone was sent home. And then there's one more tradition to note here, and that is the chalk drawings. So every May 3rd through May 4, this parking lot is shut down. Every other day, it's a parking lot. But for the commemoration, that changes, and people are encouraged to draw their memories or to use chalk to write their whatever they want. And you can see this powerful example here. Your spirit lives in me, dear Allison, drawn by one of the mourners there to commemorate the shooting. So let's go to the next. So in 2016, the site became a National Historic Landmark. That's a really remarkable date. It had already been designated a historic place, but to become a National Historic Landmark is a much higher, much more rigorous process. This is, to this date, or at least as far as I still know, the only National Historic Landmark that honors the Vietnam protests. And this happened in 2016, so ahead of the 50th commemoration. And that's pretty remarkable because typically 50 years have to pass before anything becomes a historic landmark. So it's a testament to how important, in this case, the National Park Service and the people who helped create the application feel that this is a pivotal event in US history. And there's, I believe, one more slide. And this points to how the site is still changing. So there's now a visitor center where you can go and learn about the shootings. It's a really powerful place. If you haven't been there, I highly encourage you to visit. The students who give the tours and Allison, the new director, are all excellent. And every freshman is required or strongly encouraged, so every Kent State freshman, to visit the visitor center during their freshman orientation class, so every student understands the legacy of the shootings. Also, as part of the commemorative historical landscape, there are walking tours. And here is an edit that was just made this year to the walking tours, in addition to kind of replacing them so that they could be more accessible and just generally making them a little more readable so they can handle the weather. Ohio weather can be, as you can guess, extreme. And so we wanted something more durable. There was an update to some of the text, and I think this update is pretty significant. So you can see the old version on the left and the new version on the right. The old version says 10 days later at Jackson State College in Mississippi, highway patrolmen killed 2 African-American students and wounded 12 others at a similar protest. I had the great honor of attending they call it the Gibbs Green commemoration at Jackson State. And I don't know that it's completely fair to say that it is a similar protest. There are very different things happening at Jackson State. And Jackson State, as was told to me by some of the people attending the commemoration, doesn't want to be known as a shooting that happened 10 days later. They want to be known as a shooting for their trauma that happened independently of Kent State. So you can see this text that was just, as I said, redone this year, or was finally installed this year. Jackson State, just after midnight on May 15th, Mississippi patrolmen and Jackson police kill Philip Lafayette Gibbs and James Earl Green and wound dozens at Jackson State College. Since 1971, Kent State students have linked the events with the slogan, "Long live the spirit of Kent State and Jackson State." Learn more at. And this link goes to a page at Kent State's website that is jointly written by Jackson State, which I think is important. So you can see here just another example of how we're rethinking and reframing the Kent State shootings. So with that, I want to go ahead and open us up to questions, and I want to start by asking my colleague a question. Gabby, I was really, again, moved by your presentation, and I wanted to ask something I know we've both thought about a lot, which is, how can portraits and art serve as monuments? We don't typically think of them as monuments, but in this case, perhaps they can be.
Yeah, I think, you mentioned the Vietnam War Memorial, and I think that's a great case of pointing to the overlaps between memorials and art. I think artists in their creative abilities and in speaking in a visual language have the capacity to evoke something that perhaps words fail us with. I think that it's hard to quantify and evoke all that comes with the passing of someone who we seek to memorialize, or the passing of a group of people and the trauma that comes with that. So I think, yeah, I think art has a special place in that process. It helps to evoke something that words cannot convey through something else, because as we know, I think as everybody has experienced, art has a capacity to make us feel something. And when we're talking about memorialization, remembrance, that a big part of that is emotion. And it's hard to convey that with the language or many other different types of things, which is why music also becomes such a big part of memorialization. If we think about funeral services, why do we include music? I think it enables us to engage with those feelings that come with memorialization. And actually, I have a question for you, but I also just, in the meantime, want to remind people that they can also put their comments and questions in the Q&A box, and we would be delighted to answer those. But while people are maybe thinking on those, I'm really struck by just there's some differences here, right, between Ruben Salazar and the victims of the Kent State shootings, and that Ruben Salazar was already very much known in his community. His name became even bigger afterwards. And I think about other tragedies where people have been killed, in recent years with Breonna Taylor, George Floyd. These are victims whose names we know, and they were not previously known to the public. but they indicate an ongoing tragedy that's happening. And I think with the Kent State shootings, it is interesting to me that I can't recall their names. So, and I don't know that they're widely known. So I'm wondering if can you speak to sort of like, are these names widely known? Are they widely known on campus? And maybe why do you think that is?
They're not widely known. And it's unfortunate. Not only are they not widely known, their stories are all each unique, and each of them tell a thread of the Vietnam War era. Alison Krauss was a protester. She actually attended and fundraised at Kent State to attend here in Washington the War Moratorium March.
Mm.
She really was against the Vietnam War, and she was front and center. We have another photograph, or Kent State has another photograph of her holding a banner, and she's holding up right under the A, and it's an anti-war banner. So absolutely, she was an anti-war activist, unquestionably. Sandy Scheuer was going to class when she was shot. She wasn't participating in the event. Her father had fled Germany to escape the Holocaust and brought his family to Ohio because he thought they would be safe. And she was wearing a red sweater her mom had given her until the day her mom passed away. She felt like she was to blame because she bought her that red sweater. Bill Schroeder was in the ROTC. He was preparing to serve his country. But even in his young age, he had seen the toll that fighting had taken on some of his peers. So he was a psychology major because he wanted to help his friends and colleagues and fellow soldiers better process what they were seeing. He was also proudly a mama's boy, and he would write to his mom 3 letters a week. And we were able to do an exhibit where we put some of those letters on display. And then Jeffrey Miller, he was a wanderer. He was finding himself. He had just transferred to Kent State so he could be nearer to his brother, Russ, because he admired her brother so much. He'd only been there months. But at his previous school, he'd served as the local DJ. And so we did an exhibit about his life too. We did exhibit all 4 of them in preparation for the Kent State shootings and the 50th commemoration. And his was powerful because his brother kept all of his records and they still worked. So if you came to see that exhibit, you could listen to Jeff's original records and they became a big part of the exhibit. So each of them were really unique, and they all got, for opponents, they all got put together as these Vietnam War activists who were who were just protesting, but their stories are far more complex and tell a lot richer story of what it was like to be a protester, or what it was like to be a student, or what it was like to be a sister or a brother. And it's important to know not only their names, but their stories. And that's why that was such a big part of so many of the efforts to memorialize the Kent State shootings at Kent State, was to get these names out. And that is, as you said, a thread we still see. We still see that with say their names. It's important we remember these victims, because then it becomes, I don't know, somehow much more tragic. And that's also why you saw in that last panel, we specifically wanted to name the students who were killed at Jackson State too. And so this year is the first time that their names are on the walking tour.
Yeah, it's also very heartening to hear how you, with those exhibits, worked with the families. Because I think, like, as I pointed out with Ruben Salazar, some of the ways in which he's remembered really are not in line with what the family's wishes are. And I think that so often occurs for anybody who's remembered for tragedy. They're, as you began, the photographs in which the people in them, or the family members of the victims, are really struggling with how that image has been utilized and contributes to the memory of their loved one. And I think that that's such a tricky part of memorialization. And when somebody has a much more public role or a public impact, but then balancing that with the families, it sounds like that would have been a really heartening process to work with the families and honor their wishes.
It was, and those were the first time in many cases that the families were contacted to share their memories. And I have to give credit to Lori Bose to help curate a lot of those, and is still at Kent State and still doing amazing work. Yeah, that was doing those 4 exhibits for each of the students was really one of the best things I've ever done, and one of the things I'm most proud of.
It looks like we have a question in the chat. Do you think the predominance of 24-hour news and social media reports contribute to widespread knowledge of the names of current victims of state violence, as opposed to the subject of the protest, as many of today's victims are not involved in protest or criminal activity? So do you think the predominance of 24-hour news and social media reports contribute to widespread knowledge of the names of current victims of state violence? Yeah. I mean, I'd be happy to tackle part of this too. I think I brought some of this up in relationship to this history that kind of goes back to Emmett Till. I think yeah, of course, social media has accelerated so much. And I think the ability to like hashtag a name on social media does contribute to that. But I think, as we were just talking about, there is another impact again on families, on memory, where the public almost seems to have a lot more control, and not control, but at least influence on how things are remembered. I think, there's also a lot of misinformation. There's also, it enables people to kind of contribute parts of the conversation in a much more public way, and everybody, can contribute a voice. And then on the other hand, so it's the question reads, as opposed to the subject of the protest, as many of today's victims are not involved in protest or criminal activity. And I think in this case, maybe we're talking about Breonna Taylor, George Floyd. I think though, like in terms of like protest movements and everything, there is also in that case, recognition of an injustice. And I think that perhaps if there's not a protest occurring, I think oftentimes when there's state violence, there's an injustice at hand. So I think, the idea that those names get linked to a broader movement, like Black Lives Matter, for example, is, yeah, it speaks to sort of a public discourse.
Yeah, it's an interesting question to ask. It's unquestionable that social media has changed the way we report on the world. News comes faster. Things spread quicker. One thing I mentioned earlier, that Kent State students were sent home. Imagine trying to contact your family after that. It was a challenge. Every single person who was on campus has a similar story of trying to get home without Ubers or cell phones or, a transportation system really at Kent State. And then to talk to their families when the phone lines got bogged down almost immediately. And then the reporting was so unclear. In fact, a local newspaper ran a report famously that said that a guardsman was injured and not the students. That was the flow of information. It was very rocky and uneven. And so that's different. But I think in addition to thinking about would the names be better known, it's also important to think about how social media has changed protests in gatherings, it's created a whole other track for protesting that is different from physically being in a space and occupying a protest or being part of a march or a gathering. It's very, very different now. You can protest in a lot of different ways. And, you know, one of the reasons we wanted to do this program was because the United States is coming upon a very significant anniversary. And that is the 50th anniversary of the fall of Saigon, which offers a chance to reflect on the Vietnam War. And while this is a component of it, an unescapable component, it's important to think about that era and all the people that were, and specifically about the draft and student protest and why those two things are so linked. Why it was so important to that, to many students, that they fight against the draft. And just the number of victims of the Vietnam War, which numbered over 58,000. And just how that affected everyday lives.
Exactly. I know we have another question in the chat, but Clara, I don't know if you can help us out. We have a couple raised hands.
Yeah, so let's go to the chat first. So how do you think time will affect memory or memorialization? What will be remembered in 50 years, for example?
Oh, that's a great question. We really struggled with the 50th commemoration. And I should say the 50th commemoration was canceled because of COVID. But in preparing for that, I did a lot of reading. A lot of people did a lot of benchmarking, to use a term, to try and figure out what 50th commemorations and would look like and had looked like and why they're so important. And they're interesting because it's one of the last times where such a significant amount of the people who were part of it are still living. And it's one of the last times where so many people still have a memory of the event. They remember what happened. They remember where they were. I think as we get to the 75th and the 100th, it's going to be more about legacy. And there'll still be people around for the 75th. There won't be people around for the 100th. And so those are going to be really different times. And that's why memorialization also changes over time. What would a memorial designed by Penn State students look like? Because the memorials that are up now were largely shaped by people who were victims in one way or another, whether actually injured, as Alan Canfora was, or witnesses. And the next series of commemorative or memorials will be from people who may not have that same closeness. And they may look very different. And it may be more about, you know, the struggle at Kent State. That Kent State is, you hear from a lot of students, so much more than just a shooting. So that'll be interesting to see. I'm interested to see how the next memorials are different.
Yeah, and I think, you know, another perspective on this, as it particularly relates to artists, is I think artists have always been doing this, but in recent years, I think there has been a lot of attention from artists to memorialization and uncovering histories and preserving histories. I think that we've been really privileged to see that trend, if we want to call it that, present in our Outwind Buchiver portrait competition, which occurs every 2 years. We have the next one coming up soon, so please stay tuned. But in so many of the previous iterations, and just as we see artists working today, there are a lot of efforts to create portraiture, but also art, conceptual portraits that remember people, be they close to the artists themselves or historical figures. We've been able to collect recent artworks commemorating artists such as Yolanda Lopez, who is an activist as well. That's just one example. We always see so much artistic production in the Chicano community, honoring people like Ruben Salazar, but also Cesar Chavez, Dolores Huerta. And I think that there is this artistic attention to making sure that these histories are not lost. And preserving the memory of these advocates and people who have had such a great impact on where we are today. And I think for a community like the Chicano community, having had this experience as a community that has, been oppressed, neglected, not included in sort of the canon of our national history, but still having such an importance, this artistic production to, portray these figures who have had this impact really does something to preserve our memory, preserve that history for future generations. And we will still see artists in the coming years paying homage to these figures. And I think that says a lot about how artists help us to remember.
All right, well, thank you both so much. And thank you to our audience for your wonderful questions. So if you liked this program, I put a link in the chat to where you can see our upcoming programs, the newsletter. We have 2 more great programs coming up this Hispanic Heritage Month. On September 28th, we are hosting a conversation with civil rights activist Sylvia Mendez and contemporary Puerto Rican artist Miguel Luciano. You don't want to miss that one. And then on October 15th, we are hosting a lecture by Laura Katzman, the winner of the 2024 Director's Essay Prize, which will be about Cine Alba. Thank you again for coming, and that's all we have for you.
Thanks everyone for attending.
Thank you.